Chapter 12 of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Catherine Millward. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 12. Better let blame well alone. It must have been close on to 1 o'clock when we got below the island at last, and the raft did seem to go mighty slow. If a boat was to come along, we was going to take to the canoe and break for the Illinois shore, and it was well a boat didn't come, for we hadn't ever thought to put the gun in the canoe, or a fishing line, or anything to eat. We was in rather too much of a sweat to think of so many things. It warn't good judgment to put everything on the raft. If the men went to the island, I just expect they found the campfire I built, and watched it all night for Jim to come. Anyways, they stayed away from us, and if my building and the fire never fooled them, it warn't no fault of mine. I played it as low down on them as I could. When the first streak of day began to show, we tied up to a towhead in a big bend on the Illinois side, and hacked off cottonwood branches with the hatchet, and covered up the raft with them, so that she looked like there had been a cave-in the bank there. A towhead is a sandbar that has cottonwoods on it as thick as harrow teeth. We had mountains on the Missouri shore and heavy timber on the Illinois side, and the channel was down in the Missouri shore at that place, so we weren't afraid of anybody running across us. We laid there all day and watched the rafts and steamboats spin down the Missouri shore, and upbound steamboats fight the big river in the middle. I told Jim all about the time I had jabbering with that woman, and Jim said she was a smart one, and if she was to start after us herself, she wouldn't sit down and watch a campfire. No, sir, she'd fetch a dog. Well, then, I said, why couldn't she tell her husband to fetch a dog? Jim said he bet she did think of it by the time the men was ready to start, and he believed they must have gone uptown to get a dog, and so they lost all that time. Or else we wouldn't be here on a towhead 16 or 17 mile below the village. No, indeedy, we would be in that same old town again. So I said I didn't care what was the reason they didn't get us, as long as they didn't. When it was beginning to come on dark, we poked our heads out of the cottonwood thicket, and looked up and down and across. Nothing in sight, so Jim took up some of the top planks of the raft, and built a snug wigwam to get under in blazing weather and rainy, and to keep the things dry. Jim made a floor for the wigwam, and raised it a foot or more above the level of the raft, so now the blankets and all the traps was out of reach of steamboat waves. Right in the middle of the wigwam we made a layer of dirt about 5 or 6 inches deep, with a frame around it for to hold it to its place. This was to build a fire on in sloppy weather or chilly. The wigwam could keep it from being seen. We made an extra steering oar, too, because one of the others might get broke on a snag or something. We fixed up a short forked stick to hang the old lantern on, because we must always light the lantern whenever we see a steamboat coming downstream, to keep from getting run over. But we wouldn't have to light it for upstream boats, unless we was in what they call a crossing. For the river was pretty high yet, very low banks being still a little under water, so upbound boats didn't always run the channel, but hunted easy water. The second night we run between 7 and 8 hours, with a current that was making over 4 miles an hour. We catched fish and talked, and we took a swim now and then to keep off sleepiness. It was kind of solemn drifting down the big still river, laying on our backs looking up at the stars, and we didn't ever feel like talking loud, and it wasn't often that we laughed. Only a little kind of low chuckle. We had mighty good weather as a general thing, and nothing ever happened to us at all, that night, nor the next, nor the next. Every night we passed towns, some of them away up on hillsides, nothing but just a shiny bed of lights, not a house could you see. The 5th night we passed St. Louis, and it was like the whole world lit up. In St. Petersburg they used to say there was 20 or 30,000 people in St. Louis, but I never believed it till I see that wonderful spread of lights at 2 o'clock that still night. There warn't a sound there. Everybody was asleep. Every night now I used to slip ashore towards 10 o'clock at some little village and buy 10 or 15 cents worth of meal or bacon or other stuff to eat. And sometimes I lifted a chicken that weren't roosting comfortable and took 'em along. Pap always said take a chicken when you get a chance, because if you don't want him yourself, you can easy find somebody that does, and a good deed ain't ever forgot. I never see Pap when he didn't want the chicken himself, but that is what he used to say anyway. Mornings before daylight I slipped into cornfields and borrowed a watermelon, or a mushmelon, or a pumpkin, or some new corn, or things of that kind. Pap always said it weren't no harm to borrow things if you was meaning to pay them back sometime. But the widow said it weren't anything but a soft name for stealing, and no decent body would do it. Jim said he reckoned the widow was partly right, and Pap was partly right, so the best way would be for us to pick out 2 or 3 things from the list and say we wouldn't borrow them any more. Then he reckoned it wouldn't be no harm to borrow the others. So we talked it over all one night, drifting along down the river, trying to make up our minds whether to drop the watermelon, or the cantaloupes, or the mushmelons, or what. But towards daylight we got it all settled satisfactory, and concluded to drop crabapples and persimmons. We weren't feeling just right before that, but it was all comfortable now. I was glad the way it come out, too, because crabapples ain't ever good, and the persimmons wouldn't be ripe for 2 or 3 months yet. We shot the waterfowl now and then, that got up too early in the morning, or didn't go to bed early enough in the evening. Take it all round, we lived pretty high. The 5th night below St. Louis we had a big storm after midnight, with the power of thunder and lightning, and the rain poured down in a solid sheet. We stayed in the wigwam and let the raft take care of itself. When the lightning glared out, we could see a big straight river ahead, and high rocky bluffs on both sides. By and by says I, "Hello, Jim, looky yonder." It was a steamboat that had killed herself on a rock. She was drifting straight down for her. The lightning showed her very distinct. She was leaning over, with part of her upper deck above water, and you could see every little chimbly guy clean and clear, and a chair by the old big bell, with an old slouch hat hanging on the back of it, when the flashes come. Well, it being away in the night and stormy, and also mysterious-like, I felt just the way any other boy would have felt when I seen that wreck layin' there so mournful and lonesome in the middle of the river. I wanted to get aboard of her and slink around a little, and see what there was there. So I says, "Let's land on her, Jim." But Jim was dead against it at first. He says, "I don't want her go foolin' 'long her no whack. We doin' blame well, and we better let blame well alone, as the good book says. Like as not, dey's a watchman on dat wrack." "Watchman your grandmother," I says. "There ain't nothing to watch but the Texas and the pilot-house. Do you reckon anybody's going to risk his life for a Texas and a pilot-house such a night as this, when it's likely to break up and wash down the river any minute?" Jim couldn't say nothing to that, so he didn't try. "And besides," I says, "we might borrow something worth having out of the captain's stateroom. Cigars, I bet you, and cost 5 cents apiece, solid cash. Steamboat captains is always rich, and get $60 a month, and they don't care a cent what a thing costs. You know, as long as they want it. Stick a candle in your pocket. I can't resist, Jim, till we get her a-rummagin'. Do you reckon Tom Sawyer would ever go buy this thing? Not for pie he wouldn't. He'd call it an adventure. That's what he'd call it. And he'd land on that wreck if it was his last act. And wouldn't he throw style into it? Wouldn't he spread himself, nor nothing? Why, you'd think it was Christopher Columbus discovering Kingdom Come. I wish Tom Sawyer was here." Jim, he grumbled a little, but he give in. He said we mustn't talk any more than we could help, and then talk mighty low. The lightning showed us the wreck again just in time, and we fetched the starboard derrick and made fast there. The deck was high out here. We went sneaking down the slope of it till aboard, in the dark, toward the Texas, feeling our way slow with our feet, and spreading our hands out to fend off the guys, for it was so dark We couldn't see no sign of them. Pretty soon we struck the forward end of the skylight and clumb onto it, and the next step fetched us in front of the captain's door, which was open, and by Jiminy, away down through the Texas hall we see light, and all in the same second we seemed to hear low voices in yonder. Jim whispered and said he was feeling powerful sick, and told me to come along. I says all right, and was going to start for the raft, but just then I heard a voice wail out and say, "Oh, please don't, boys, I swear I won't ever tell." Another voice said pretty loud, "It's a lie, Jim Turner. You've acted this way before. You always want more'n your share of the truck, and you've always got it, too, because you've swore it. If you didn't get it, you'd tell. But this time you've said it just one time too many. You're the meanest, treacherousest hound in this country." By the time Jim was gone for the raft, I was just a-billin' with curiosity, and I says to myself, Tom Sawyer wouldn't back out now, and so I won't either. I'm going to see what's going on here. So I dropped on my hands and knees in the little passage and crept aft in the dark till there weren't but one stateroom betwixt me and the cross hull of the Texas. Then and there I see a man stretched on the floor and tied hand and foot, and two men standing over him, and one of them had a dim lantern in his hand, and the other one had a pistol. The one kept pointing his pistol at the man's head on the floor and saying, "I'd like to, and I order to, mean skunk." The man on the floor would shrivel up and say, "Oh, please don't, Bill, I ain't never going to tell." And every time he said that, the man with the lantern would laugh and say, "Did you ain't? You ever said no truer thing than that, you bet you." And once he said, "Hear him beg, and yet if we hadn't gotten the best of him and tied him, he'd a-kill us both. And what for? Just for nothing, just because we stood on our rights, that's what for. But I lay you ain't a-going to threaten nobody no more, Jim Turner. Put up that pistol, Bill." Bill says, "I don't want to, Jake Packard. I'm for killing him. And didn't he kill old Hatfield just the same way? And don't he deserve it?" "But I don't want him killed, and I've got my reasons for it." "Bless your heart for them words, Jake Packard. I never forget you long's I live," says the man on the floor, sort of blubbering. Packard didn't take no notice of that, but hung up his lantern on a nail and started toward where I was there in the dark, and motioned Bill to come. I crawfished as fast as I could about 2 yards, but the boat slanted so that I couldn't make very good time so as to keep from getting run over and catched. I crawled into a stateroom on the upper side. The men came a-pawing along in the dark, and when Packard got to my stateroom, he says, "Here, come in here." And in he come, and Bill after him. But before they got in, I was up in the upper berth, cornered, and sorry I come. Then they stood there with their hands on the ledge of the berth and talked. I couldn't see them, but I could tell where they was by the whiskey they'd been having. I was glad I didn't drink whiskey, but it wouldn't made much difference anyway, because most of the time they couldn't have treated me because I didn't breathe. I was too scared, and besides, a body couldn't breathe and hear such talk. They talked low and earnest. Bill wanted to kill Turner. He says, "He said he'll tell, and he will. If he was to give both our shares to him now, it wouldn't make no difference after the row and the way we've served him. Sure's you're born, he'll turn state's evidence. Now you hear me. I'm for putting him out of his troubles." "So am I," says Packard very quiet. "Blame it, I'd sorter begun to think you wasn't. Well, then, that's all right. Let's go and do it." "Hold on a minute. I hain't had my said yet. You listen to me. Shooting's good, but there's quieter ways of the thing's got to be done. But what I say is this. It ain't good sense to go courting around after a halter if you can get at what you're up to in some way that's just as good, and at the same time don't bring you into no risks. Ain't that so?" "You bet it is. But how you going to manage it this time?" "Well, my idea is this. We'll rustle around and gather up whatever pickings we've overlooked in the staterooms, and shove for shore and hide the truck. Then we'll wait. Now I say, it ain't a-goin' to be more'n 2 hours before this wreck breaks up and washes off down the river. See? He'll be drownded, and won't have nobody to blame for it but his own self. I reckon that's a considerable sight better'n killin' of him. I'm unfavourable to killin' a man as long as you can get around it. It ain't good sense. It ain't good morals. Ain't I right? Yes, I reckon you are, but s'pose she don't break up and wash off? Well, we can wait the 2 hours anyway and see, can't we? All right, then, come along. So they started, and I lit out, all in a cold sweat, and scrambled forward. It was dark as pitch there, but I said in a kind of coarse whisper, "Jim!" And he answers up, right at my elbow, with a sort of moan, and so I says, "Quick, Jim! It ain't no time for fooling around and moaning. There's a gang of murderers in yonder, and if we don't hunt up their boat instead of drifting down the river so's these fellows can't get away from the wreck, there's one of 'em going to be in a bad fix. But if we find their boat, we can put all of 'em in a bad fix, for the sheriff will get 'em. Quick! Hurry! I'll hunt the larboard side. You hunt the starboard. You start the raft and—" "Oh, my lordy, lordy, raft! That ain't no raft no more. She done broke loose and gone. And here we is." End of chapter 12.